Okay, we're going to be talking about interpersonal effectiveness and how to boost it. And what this is a distillation of some skills from a type of therapy called DBT. And what I've done is just taken one of the modules and I just want to briefly run through um, some of the ways that these skills can improve your communication, your social skills, your negotiation skills, and above all, assertiveness. Um, I think it's particularly important right now as dealing with the pandemic. A lot of students have gone home to live with their families again, or maybe you're stuck with your roommates and nobody's leaving the house very much. And it's easy for relationship problems to come up, particularly right now because you're in closer quarters and you may be encountering uh, new boundaries with people, personal boundaries, emotional boundaries, physical boundaries. And it's really easy to find yourself getting into conflict. And so I'd just like to spend a few minutes today on talking about some ways that you can improve these relationships and make your communication skills a little more effective, not as a way of avoiding conflict, but on dealing with it effectively. Um, so, what does that mean? Interpersonal effectiveness is really about getting your objectives met in relationships. Um, it's asking for what you want, it's the ability to say no, and it's the ability to negotiate conflict without damaging the relationship. So, a key part of it is assertiveness, which is a healthy way of communicating with people. So there's a lot of components to this. When you're communicating and getting your needs met, you need to respect yourself as well as the other person. You need to listen as well as communicate effectively. It goes both ways. And it involves dealing with difficult people. So right now, maybe you've been accustomed to living at college and not having to abide by your parents' rules or living with your siblings. Um, and so a whole host of issues may be coming back up. Maybe your roommates before were out most of the time and you didn't cross paths very much, but now either you're not working or not working as much, you're not in class. And so you're finding yourself at loggerheads with people that you used to get along with. So it involves dealing with difficult people or people that are becoming difficult because of the situation. And maybe you're finding yourself people that used to get along with that you need to repair relationships with. This is a way of improving that. And as I said before, a lot of this involves recognizing your values and sticking to your guns and saying no when you feel like your values are being compromised. And for a lot of people, that can be difficult. So generally, there are three types of communication styles that people have. Um, one of them is passive. And in borderline personality disorder, which is what DBT was originally designed to treat, there are a lot of people that had a passive communication style. They tend to act very meek and they put other people's needs ahead of their own, um, which is okay in the short term. But in the long term, what they found is these same people would get very frustrated and resentful because eventually their needs were not being met in the relationship. They weren't being entirely candid with people. Um, they're pretending that things are okay. They're agreeing to things that they really resent agreeing to. So that ultimately results in blowing up, depression, and it ends up cutting off relationships because they're too painful to maintain. So that is not an effective communication style, passivity. It may feel okay in the short term, but as I said, in the long term, it ultimately undermines the relationship. Then we have an aggressive communication style. This may be more recognizable. It's more domineering, pushing people away. And some people vacillate back and forth between passive and aggressive. And there's passive aggression is one way of taking the worst elements of these two. Um, these are things like slamming the door, being condescending with people, um, basically on the surface being nice, but it's coming from a place where you're trying to actually um, coming from an aggressive place towards the other person where you have aggressive intent. So the aggressive style is really coming from a place of having a real strong sense of the way things should be or how other people got to act. Um, it's a need to be in control of interpersonal relationships. So that again is ineffective. That tends to repel people in the long term. It doesn't lead to healthy relationships. Um, so there is a middle ground between these two, and it's called assertiveness. And that's not the same as passive aggressiveness. Assertiveness walks a fine line between the two, and it can lead to healthier relationships. Um, and assertiveness is really about um, standing up for yourself and being honest in your communication about what you want and being clear about what you want and what you don't want. And so when we say interpersonal effectiveness, it's really another word for it. It would be synonymous with assertiveness. So that's what we're talking about. So what kind of interpersonal effectiveness are we talking about today? Well, there's three components to it. There's objective effectiveness. So this is really goal oriented. It's about attaining your goals in a situation, getting what you want in an interaction. It's getting your wishes taken seriously. So this is a way of standing up for your rights so they're taken seriously. It can be requesting that other people do something in a way that you want them to do it. It also entails refusing unreasonable demands and making your refusal stick. So it's easy to just say, no, no, thank you, no, thank you. And eventually you cave in when you really don't want to. It's harder to make the refusal stick. This is also a way of resolving interpersonal conflict, and it's a way of getting your point of view taken seriously. Now, these skills are not a guarantee. There's a lot of other factors that come into it. It can be if you're sick, if you're tired, if you're overwhelmed, if it's just the wrong time of day. This is not going to necessarily guarantee that these are going to be effective. It's important, though, when you're getting your objectives met, that you don't revert to an aggressive style. So that's objective effectiveness. One way of looking at this would be maybe you have something very specific that you need to be clear about that you want in a relationship. This can be something as simple as going up to your mechanic in the garage. But maybe it's not as useful in a situation with your partner or your parent or your sibling or your best friend. That would be where relationship effectiveness comes in. So when we say relationship effectiveness, I mean closer relationships, not just transactional. So relationship effectiveness is really more of an art. It's a way of maintaining or improving your relationships while you try to get what you want. So there you do have an objective, and optimally you're going to get what you want and the person likes you more than before. So you want to improve the relationship. You want the other person to give you what you're asking for, or at least feel good about saying no. And so since it's a relationship, you're balancing your immediate goals with a long-term goal of maintaining the relationship or improving it. Now, if your primary goal in this situation, let's say it's your dad, is to get him to approve you or stop criticizing, or just enhancing the relationship, if that's your objective, then you could apply the objective effectiveness. It could be considered under that category. And your objective would be to improve or keep the relationship and not damage it in the long run. So it could fall into that category too, overlap. And so this is really about dispelling some myths too that you encounter when you practice these skills, like a relationship effectiveness skills. One myth is if you self-sacrifice your own needs or wants, then the relationship will improve and the problems will magically go away. That's obviously a myth. That's not true. And that's what we talked about with passivity, that might be effective in the short term to avoid conflict, but it comes roaring back. So if you draw a timeline of your past relationships with people, if you constantly subvert your own needs for the relationship's sake, what happens if you look back on when you've ever done that is resentment builds up. It leads to inequity, and then it leads to a blow up. And in the worst case, it leads to the relationship ending. Has that ever happened to you? So if you use these skills earlier in a timeline, you could do it without jeopardizing the relationship. So especially in longer term relationships, this can take practice. And then finally, the third element of this is self-respect effectiveness. And this has to come in all ways of communicating with people. You have to respect yourself at the end of the day. So that means just maintaining or improving positive feelings about yourself. You got to respect your own values and your own beliefs. At the same time, you're trying to gain your objectives. So you want to act in ways that fit your own sense of morality and make you feel competent. If you just give in or lie to people please, or seek approval, you act helpless to get what you want, that diminishes your own self-respect in the long term, even though you might get what you want. It also reduces your mastery. So putting that all together, all three types of effectiveness factor into every conflict or interpersonal problem situation. But at any given time, one or more may become more or less important, depending on your priorities. So, let's just say that your landlord keeps your deposit on your rent, and you have to deal with that conflict. That's more of an objective situation. Your best friend wants to come over and talk about a problem that you guys had, and you're ready to go to bed. You're just tired and don't want to have the conversation tonight. That's a relationship one. And you want a raise from your boss, and your boss has been giving you more responsibilities without compensating you for it, which you feel is unfair. So standing up to your boss would involve self-respect. And of course, you can have skills in one situation, but not in others. And there may be some weaknesses in some areas. So that's something you can focus on when you think about your interpersonal effectiveness. So what are some ways to get your needs met effectively? Well, this is a very simplified version of the next slide that's going to come, that goes into more depth about it. But sometimes it involves just making a simple request. So this can be very difficult for some people, particularly people that are passive. And it takes practice, like a muscle getting stronger. You can start with something small, and it'll get easier. But if you've never done this, then it'll feel strange. It might even feel selfish. But you're making a simple request to somebody. Just give a very brief justification. This can be just explaining in a sentence what the problem is. Back to the boss, you can say, the problem would be that I've been staying late for work. I've been doing more assignments for you. I've been coming in earlier. I've gained a lot of new skills. I'm bringing in more revenue, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not getting paid for it, what I think I deserve. So that's a brief justification. Then you can add a softening statement. This is just to kind of disarm them and let them know that you're not here to go to battle, that this is all in good faith. And then after that, you can give a direct, specific question. Say what you want clearly and very precisely. So it's not just I'm upset, it's I feel like I deserve a raise, and say what the amount is, how much you think you deserve. Be very specific and clear. And then offer kind of an appreciation reinforcement. So if you did that, I'd really appreciate it. That would be great. And that's what we see in the next slide. So one of the components of objective effectiveness is Dear Man. That's the acronym. The D stands for describe. You want to describe the situation you're reacting to, and that's the way to start out. So that's kind of what I did in the previous slide, but the real key is to just stick to the facts. Don't use judgmental statements. Don't bring up feelings yet. It's not the time for that. Just describe exactly what you feel or believe about the situation. I'm sorry, just describe the situation. Don't describe how you feel about it yet. We're not there yet. So just be as objective as possible. What you're reacting to, just stick to the facts. Okay? The facts are I've been staying till 6 p.m. every night. Been working harder, doing more work, and I'm not getting compensated for it. The next component is express your feelings about the situation, and you want to express them very clearly. Describe how you feel or what you believe about it, and you don't expect the other person to mind read. They probably don't know exactly what your feelings are. They may not be self-evident. So this is a way of, first, you're objective. This is a situation, staying late. This is how I feel. I feel like, I'm tired when I go home from work. I'm not looking forward to it anymore. And I feel like I'm getting shortchanged. This is a time to express your opinion. Next component is asserting yourself. This is asserting your wishes specifically. Ask for what you want, and this is a time to say no clearly. And again, don't expect people to know what you want them to do if you don't tell them. The main goal here is just to be clear, concise, and assertive. Don't beat around the bush. Don't expect them to read your mind. Okay? So just don't assume that others are not going to figure out what you want unless you ask them directly for what you want. The fourth component here is similar to the one in the last slide. Reinforce them. What I mean by reinforce is it's kind of a reward. You do that by explaining the consequences, either positive or negative, if the other person doesn't do as you ask. So in psychology, this is like a form of operant conditioning. Behavior is controlled by good consequences versus bad, carrot or stick, right and wrong. So you reward people who positively respond to you when you ask for something. You say no or express an opinion. And sometimes you can do this before they respond by telling them the positive effects of getting what you want. So this is what I said earlier, like, if you did this for me, that would be great. I'd really appreciate it. You can tell them the positive outcomes for you. It could be the positive outcomes for them. I think you'd really be happy if, I'm happier. And the positive aspects for the relationship. It would mean the world to me if you could come for a visit. It'd be deeply grateful If you give me what I want, thank you so much for waiting. How can I help you? Um, I'm swamped today. You'd be doing me a really big favor if you could da da da. Um, Another route you can do is, if it's appropriate, is tell the person the negative effects of you not getting what you want. Um, "Oh, I'm sorry, I won't be able to drive you to work until you clean the kitchen. I can't finish that project without your help. That might be with a roommate. And sometimes you can use a combination of a positive or negative that can be effective. When you talk to me that way, it hurts my feelings, and I don't want to be with you. If we could work on this together, I think our relationship would improve. I really want to spend the afternoon with you, but I won't be able to unless you meet me halfway." So that's kind of a half reinforcement. You're giving them the good and the bad. Really, what you want to do is try to make the other person feel good about granting your request. But it's important you don't offer the other person something you can't deliver. You want to be realistic and you want to be genuine. As with all of these, being genuine is very important. If you're using it to manipulate somebody, this will backfire, I guarantee you. So you can reward the person afterwards too. "Thank you, you've been very kind. I really appreciate it. I'll return the favor. What would I do without you?" Um, so the next part is being mindful of your goals or your objective in the situation. So keep focused on that. Asking a request or saying no. It's important that you maintain your position, not get distracted, which can be easy to do if this is somebody that you're not um, having a good relationship with. Um, so one of the techniques of kind of holding your ground, if you find yourself getting overwhelmed in making these requests, is a broken record. Keep asking, keep saying no, keep expressing the same opinion over and over again. Oftentimes when people get frazzled when they're having a conversation like this, where they're requesting something or they're refusing, um, what happens is they keep coming up with new reasons, or they keep getting sidetracked and justifying saying no or their request. And less is more here. You don't have to think of something different each time to say. Just stick with yourself like a broken record that's skipping. Um, when you do that, it's important to keep a mellow tone of voice, kill them with kindness. But this is all about persistence. Just come right back to what your request was. Um, I'm I'm working more than I anticipated or that I was told, and I would like a raise. Just keep repeating that. Um, Another part is, if the person does start to get aggressive with you, if they start attacking, threatening, or they try to change the subject, ignore the threat, ignore the comment, ignore the diversion. Don't respond to them. Um, don't get distracted. Just keep making your point. When you do this, you can practice your breathing. Just repeat your point, and stick to the guns. Oftentimes people get worn out by this, that none of those maneuvers work. And you're reinforcing that you believe in what you say, and you're sticking to your simple point. It's a very simple request. You're not making it more complex than it is. One thing that can be used in the service of that is appearing confident. And what do I mean by that? Well, with a lot of these skills, it's really more important. It's really better to use these in person than, say, over text or email. This could be used on a virtual platform, but interpersonal effectiveness is really something that's best face to face. It's easier to gauge people's intentions that way. So appearing confident, stand up straight, make good eye contact when you make a request or when you say no. It shows conviction. Don't stammer, don't back off. And when you're doing this, it can, if you don't feel confident, it can be kind of one of these fake it till you make it type things. Act your way into a new way of thinking. So think of yourself as competent and confident. As weird as it feels, the more you do this, like with anything, like an exercise, it'll get easier. And so you will be more confident. People will take you more seriously when you start to behave like it. Um, but you have to take yourself seriously. And as with the self-respect component, you have to respect yourself. If you don't, other people will recognize that and they won't respect you. So you can tie this in with a practice of self-validation, um, and just telling yourself that your needs and your wants are valid. Um, the final part is negotiate. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that later, but you want to negotiate with the person, to arrive at some realistic solutions to the problem. So this means be willing to give in order to get. Um, if it's going nowhere in the conversation, offer and ask for alternative solutions from them. Turn the tables. Um, in other words, turn the problem over to them and ask for some alternatives. What do you think we should do? Um, I'm not able to say yes, and you really seem to want me to. So what can we do here? This is helpful when ordinary requesting or refusing is just hits a wall. You're going around this, or you're going around in circles. If it's not working, um, you can just describe. You can kind of start over, describe the current situation, express your wishes, and then you can defer till later. Maybe you don't have to come to an agreement right now. Um, Another thing you can do is just reduce your request, but this involves knowing what you're willing to give up. You have to know your bottom line, what you're willing to compromise. Um, and as I said, I'll have something more to say about that later, but the key here is really to focus on what'll work. So now we're going to move on to relational effectiveness. This would be something you use more with closer relationships, people that you know a little bit better, longer term maybe. So when you're communicating, again, making a request or a refusal, it's important to be gentle. This means no attacks, no judging, guilt trips, no calling names, no condescension. Think about times where somebody's trying to influence you and you felt judged. Have you ever felt judged by somebody? It's not fun. And so to be effective, again, this is not about getting a jab in and feeling good in the short term. This is about maintaining a long-term relationship. People tend to respond better to gentleness versus harshness. Most people. So avoid attacks, avoid threats, avoid judgment. If you notice that coming up, you have to keep that in check. And so this is where a practice, and this also comes up in DBT, a practice like mindfulness might be helpful. And that's beyond the scope of this discussion, but noticing what's coming up, noticing those old habitual responses that come up. If you feel like you need to attack to somebody or threaten them, then at least being aware of that and not reacting that way. So no verbal or physical attacks. If there's anger, express that in a healthy way. Express it directly. I feel. No manipulating statements. No hidden threats either. And if the other person, if you're making a request to them, they say no, then tolerating that. And so stay in the discussion, even if it gets painful, and exit gracefully if you need to. No moralizing. No, if you're a good person, you do this, or no, you should or you shouldn't. This is kind of a gentle approach. Half of this is just diffusing what could be turned into a charged situation. Another part is act interested. And by act, I don't mean put on an act like, a drama class. I mean, be interested and act that way too. Have it reflect in your actions. So listen and be interested in the other person just as you'd want them to be interested in you. And this means really listening to their point of view, right? Active listening is what they call it. Listen to their opinion, listen to their reasons for saying no. It's so easy in these situations just get caught up in what you want without considering that you're actually talking to another person with their own frame of references. So listen to where they're coming from. If they're making a request of you, then listen to their reasons for it. At the same time, as I mentioned in the previous slide, be aware of your own assertiveness in your body language and your facial expression. You know, there are ways to show that you're interested, and one way is maintaining eye contact, giving facial responses that indicate you're listening, nodding, leaning forward if you're sitting. Um, don't interrupt the other person or talk over them. Let them say their piece and be sensitive to their desire to have the discussion at a later time if that's what they want. You know, if this is something, this is a relationship that's important, you can give it time. It doesn't need to be fixed immediately. Sometimes going to bed and sleeping on it is the best thing, even if not for you, then for them. Um, People tend to feel better about you if you're actually listening to them. You know, if you think about somebody where you've had conversations with them and told them very deep things or important things about yourself, and you found out later they weren't really listening because they're asking you questions that they wouldn't ask if they heard you. You know, it doesn't feel very good. So, you know, this is really about active listening, um, understanding where they're coming from. And I'll have a little bit more to say about assertive listening and some blocks to listening and in a couple slides later. And also validating, acknowledge their feelings, their wants, their difficulties, their opinions, and to do that in a non-judgmental way. Validating somebody, it doesn't mean agreement. Um, this is something that takes a lot of practice. You know, you have to think about what problems they're having with your request or saying no. And you got to validate their needs and their desires, but you can state the clear preference not to do it. You don't need to argue, just validate and decline. So this can happen, you know, when you're disagreeing with somebody, in other words. I'd prefer, I'm uncomfortable. Um, you know, again, those are feeling words. So you're acknowledging their feelings, but you can then mention your own. You can't really argue with feelings. You know, we can dispute the facts, we can dispute logic, but your feelings are just your feelings. Um, you can do a mutual validation. I understand where you're coming from, but on my end, da 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 da. So that's basically saying that there's two point of views, there's two motivations, and you're understanding and acknowledging both. You're stating yours clearly, and you're restating theirs. You're that you understand where they're coming from. Another technique is clouding, where you agree in part to what they're saying. So sometimes when people get an argument with you, they'll say, "You always do this," or "You never take out the trash," or "You never do this for me. You're always late." So what you can, instead of counterattacking in those situations, what you can do is agree in part. So you can say, "You know what? You're right. I last night I was late on getting back to you. Last week I was late in picking you up, but that's not always the case, and I'd like to improve on that." So you're not really challenging them all the way. You're acknowledging they have a point, but you're not that you're going with them, right? You're not fighting them on how inaccurate they are. And people, that tends to de-escalate situations. You just give them a little sliver of credit for where they actually were right. Probing. This is happening, when you're getting in, when you hit an impasse with somebody, and um, you home in on exactly where the disagreement lies in order to understand it. That's a form of validation. So sometimes we can use global statements, you know, like I said before, always and never, those sweeping statements. And when you dig underneath that a little bit, you probe, you can find out that the disagreement is actually on something very small. Um, and if you can find out what that is, that's a lot easier to deal with than just saying that, somebody um, is irresponsible, you're always late. It's real easy to find out what specific incident caused the problem, if that's the case, than just, you know, assigning somebody the label of irresponsible. Again, specifics are easier to deal with. They depersonalize it. And assertive delay. This can happen. You can take some time off to cool off, minutes or days. Doesn't really matter how long. But again, if there's a relationship, it doesn't need to be fixed immediately. And then finally, use an easy manner. Little humor goes a long way. So does smiling. Um, it's being mellow and relaxed. Let go of some of the tension, anger, rage, and judgments. This is in advertising. This is a soft sell instead of a hard sell. Um, it's much more nice and more effective than being pushy or browbeating when the relationship is at stake, when that's important. Now, I should mention that you may not use this in every situation. With like abusive people, a harsher, more direct approach would be necessary. So there are some people that you should not use an easy manner with, that might not be effective with them. And with a lot of these acronyms that I'm using, it's good to role play this and just practice it out, like on a small scale. So here's the acronym FAST that we're using with self-respect effectiveness. And again, this is the third component of assertiveness. You have to respect yourself at the end of the day. So this involves just being fair, like that, it's maybe evident. Be fair to yourself, be fair to the other person as you're attempting to solve the problem. It's hard to like yourself in the long run if you take advantage of other people. So you have to live with yourself. So when you're getting in discussions with people, negotiations, um, be fair. Apologies. Don't be overly apologetic. People don't like that. It can reduce your self-efficacy over time, and it suggests to other people that you're wrong. It's kind of like telling lies. Maybe white lies that'll enhance the relationship at times, but over time, it undermines your self-respect, and it quickly gets on other people's nerves. So not apologizing for being alive, for not apologizing for making a request at all, not apologizing for having an opinion, and not apologizing for disagreeing. A lot of times passive people will do this, and they don't realize the effect that it has on other people. It does not make them like you more. It can damage your self-respect because it reinforces self-invalidation and judgments about yourself, your effectiveness, and your worth as a person. So you eventually come to believe it. Third part is stick to your values. Stick to your own values. So when it's appropriate, express your opinions on, religious, political, personal issues. Don't keep quiet just to avoid being judged or sounding dumb. It's okay to let others know where you're coming from. You don't have to change your mind on moral or ethical or value-laden issues without a good reason. But don't confuse this with flexibility or lack of integrity. Don't. Um, those are two different things. So you can have integrity and still maintain flexibility, and vice versa. You can hold opinions about that are different from other people, still respect and be respected in the spirit of true tolerance, while also being a little flexible, trying to understand where they're coming from, not being rigid. But you can hold to your principles, and people tend to respect that too. And that's, again, like anything, it gets easier to do that over time the more you do it. And it actually strengthens your convictions when you actually act on them that way, when you honor them. And truthfulness, I alluded to this earlier. Don't lie, especially this can become problematic when it's habitual. So don't lie or act helpless when you're not. Don't exaggerate. Don't make up excuses. Tell others what you need or what you want. That's good enough. If you distort the truth, like even telling little white lies to spare somebody's feelings, um, that can easily twist. It can morph into bigger lies, and again, it can become habitual. Um, there are situations where it's more benign or innocuous. So if you're going to do that, does this does this shirt or this dress make me look fat? Did the dinner taste good that I cooked? Be mindful about when you are using that. And so this part is really coming up with a script. Like I said, this takes practice. And so this is not something that's going to happen overnight. It involves, thinking about what you're going to say. And sometimes it can even involve writing it out beforehand. If it's a really high stakes conversation that you want to have, don't feel weird about writing it out beforehand. Because what happens when you go into situations when your emotions are, you can go into a conversation that you plan to have and it will not go according to plans when your emotions take hold. So knowing that ahead of time allows you to plan and come up with a script. Again, less can be more sometimes. So this gets back to the Dear Man acronym that you used earlier. This is just kind of a simplified version of it. So you don't go into those, you don't revert into passive or aggressive patterns in these conversations. They don't get derailed. So keep it simple. And you can develop it in advance, like I said. And there are three basic components to this, and the fourth is optional. First part is you want to start your sentence out with "I think." So this just focuses on the facts and you're understanding what's going on. It doesn't include, judgments or assumptions about the other person's motives. It shouldn't be an attack. I think is a clear description of events and experiences that you see, and that you need to talk about and maybe change. Here's some examples. I think we haven't spent much time together lately. 2 nights last week, one the week before. Boom. Those are facts. Those are indisputable. You've billed me for a repair on my receipt here for $92 that I did not authorize. That's a fact. Looking back at the recent past, I think you've been late for the majority of our meetings. That's either true or false. That's a fact. I'm getting back from the airport late, around 11 o'clock. And again, so these are times very specific and they're just focused on objective facts. There isn't much hint of an emotion in any of these. And there's no disapproval in the statement of facts. So you got that up front, you got the facts, I think. Then you include the component I feel. This is optional. And you're probably going to be more likely to use this with a friend or family member, but not with the boss or garage mechanic. Maybe you would, but more likely with long-term relational effectiveness. Purpose here is just to give a brief, non-pejorative description of the emotion that was triggered by the situation. So a lot of communication specialists will call this component an I statement in assertiveness training. It's because it's about you and your particular feelings. So any sentence about your emotions should start with I. I feel scared. I feel lonely. Lately, I feel sad about us. I feel hurt with a twinge of giving up. I feel kind of lost, invisible, and more disconnected from you. I feel rejected. I feel hopeless but nervous. Um, so some people will try to use this in a manipulative way, or it can naturally happen. So some people say you statements to look like I statements. It's kind of a charade. And it's obvious to detect these because it'll say, I feel that you. So I feel that you're selfish. I feel that you're an asshole. I feel that you're never home. I feel that you're manipulating me. So notice that there's a judgment there, not a feeling. And that forms the core of these communications. So that's where it's coming from. It's safer than an I statement because it makes you, the speaker, less vulnerable, but it communicates nothing about your actual emotional experience. So it defeats the purpose. So that's just a covert attack. Um, so I feel, I think, I feel. I want. So this is the component where this basically the crux of assertiveness. And you need to think it through really carefully. So here's some guidelines. You want to ask in this request that I want, it could be a need or a want. You want to ask for behavioral change, not attitudinal change. So why is that? Because behavior is concrete, it's measurable, it's something the person has control over. You can't reasonably expect somebody to just drop what they believe or feel just because you don't like it. It doesn't work that way. If somebody told you to just automatically change your opinion and your beliefs because they requested it, you wouldn't. So beliefs and feelings are not under our voluntary control. So just keeping that in mind. But you can ask someone to change how they act and what they do. That's under their control. Another part of this is do not give a laundry list. Give a request for one change at a time. When you give more than one, it tends to overwhelm people and make them feel pressured. So just focus on one at a time. It could be the most important one, it could be the biggest one in your mind, or it could be the smallest one. But just do it in increments if you're going to do it, and just focus on one at a time. Um, ask for something that can be changed now too, more immediately. So not, the next time we go on vacation, I want you to blah, blah, blah. That's a poor I want statement, because whenever your next vacation finally arrives, especially now, the pandemic, we don't know when things are going to open back up. Who knows what's going to happen? It'll be long forgotten. So the more immediate, the better. It's something that can be changed in the short term, if not right now. Be specific and be concrete. So vague requests like I want you to be nicer, that's not going to get you anywhere, because what does that mean? My definition of nice could differ vastly from yours. So describe exactly, be specific and concrete about a new behavior that you expect. I want you to show up at 7 o'clock to pick me up. I want you to, um, not call me names when we get together. Not be nice. That's just too opaque. And say when and where you want it to occur. So the more specific, the better. That way you can tell if somebody actually did it or not. We can always argue if you're nice or not, but we can't argue about the fact that if you didn't call me a name when we hung out last time, that's very specific. So ask someone for 20 minutes of help doing research on the internet is more effective than requesting quote unquote technological assistance. You see the difference? The fourth one is optional. You don't always need to do this. It's a self-care solution. So just asking for things is not always enough in some situations. Sometimes you need to give people encouragement or reinforcement before they're motivated to do something. So I kind of talked about this earlier. Um, this type of encouragement is it's part of an assertive script called the self-care solution. It's nothing more than just telling the other person what you're going to do to take care of yourself if they don't comply with your request. It's not the same thing as threatening or punishing them. It's just giving them information and showing them that you're not helpless. You do have a plan to solve the problem. Here's some examples. If you can't leave for the party on time, I'm going to take my own car. If you can help me out with cleaning the kitchen this week, maybe with your roommate, I'll hire somebody and we'll divide the expense. Again, don't bluff this. You want to be honest. Don't say anything you wouldn't be willing to do, but show them that you have an alternative plan in mind that you're willing to follow through on. If you can't find a way to keep the party noise down, I'll ask the police to help you. If you want to drive without insurance, I'll transfer the title to your name, and you can take the payments as well. So again, intent matters. None of these are designed to hurt the other person. They're really just about protecting your own rights, taking care of your own needs. So this is really at the heart of what we've been talking about, assertive listening. You know, acting and speaking is one way, and listening is the other component. That's what communication is about. So, as I mentioned earlier, you want to really fully commit to understanding what the other person's thinking, what their opinions are about the problem, just as you're sharing what your feelings and thinking, thoughts on the situation are. You want to be direct, use active questions. So active listening means you're asking questions about them because you're coming from a place where you're earnestly trying to understand where they're coming from. You're trying to understand their point of view, to step into their world. So some of the blocks to listening, there's 10. One is mind reading. This is pretending that you know what they're thinking without really knowing what they're thinking. It's easy to do this. And oftentimes we can get it twisted because it's coming more from our gut and it may not be based on facts. So be specific when you're asking questions, exactly what their opinion is or their feelings rather than trying to read their mind. Even if you know them really well and you might be good at it, it can often go astray. Rehearsing. This happens when you're pretending to listen to somebody. You're just thinking about the next thing that you want to say, the next brilliant statement that you want to make. And all the while you're rehearsing in your mind, you're not really listening to them. And when they finish talking, you're going to end up saying something that's not really related to what they just said. Or it won't have factored it in. Filtering. This is like when they say, they could be speaking in a paragraph and you just focus on one word, you filter out everything else, and you harp on that one word and that becomes your sole focus and that's what you're responding to, but you've taken it out of context. You've let it override everything else they've said. So essentially you've distorted their opinion. You're judging. People can tell when you're judging even if you're not saying anything. So again, it's easy to do. Most of us do it at some point, but be mindful when you're doing it because oftentimes it can distract you from the point of what the person is saying. And it can easily turn in from a conversation to a heated argument that way. Daydreaming, this is just boredom. You've zoned out. And by the time they finish, you're not really gonna have an accurate understanding of where they're coming from. So sometimes when this is happening, it can be good to just defer the conversation to a later time because when you're able to focus on what they're saying. Maybe you're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, you know, so you find yourself daydreaming. Advising is another one. You know, you're not really listening. You're thinking about just giving advice to them. When you're feeling like you're sparring, you're already arguing with them in your mind. Um, Being right, you know, would you rather be right or be happy is a question a lot of times people ask in these situations. So there's nothing wrong with wanting to believing you're right and you want to make your point, but if that's your top priority and you're willing to sacrifice anything for that, then it portends poorly um, for the relationship. So be aware when you have that tendency of being right and what the cost might be. Derailing, um, just getting sidetracked and getting off the point, detouring off the main point of the conversation. Again, this is when it turns into an argument. You may focus on something that's peripheral to the main point, and it just takes you in a whole different direction. And it can be hard to get back on the main road after that. And placating, if you're just going along pretending to agree with the person, you're not really being honest, but you're just trying to avoid conflict in the meantime. That's not really being assertive in your listening, because you're just trying to get through the conversation. You're saying yes, and you're not really listening. So I mentioned some of this already, but if they aren't listening to you, mutual validation, using the broken record, no, 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 sticking to your point, probing them for specifically um, where they're coming from, clouding, that's kind of the partial agreement, and assertive delay, and that's a key point here. When you have an important relationship, it's okay to delay coming to an agreement, or resolving a conflict until another day. It doesn't have to be an immediate fix. So this is the last acronym we're going to focus on, and it's RAVEN. So this is really about negotiating specifically. All of these can be used in negotiating, but this is specifically for negotiating. The goal of negotiating is to change your partner's view on a mutual interest. So how can you and I get our needs met without sacrificing our relationship? So to do that successfully, it means having an outcome where neither of us feels cheated, manipulated, or taken advantage of. So when a conflict requires a negotiation, you want to begin with a position that you each need validating. So the first component on this checklist is relax. So just accept the conflict calmly. Take a deep breath before you say the next thing. Release the tension as you exhale. Okay, this is kind of like the gentle part before the easy manner. Just your disposition, your attitude has a lot to do with this. Avoid the aversive. Keep in mind that, aversive strategies you might be tempted to use, like attack, going through the jugular. Monitor what you want to say to avoid them. Be mindful when they come up. Validate the other person's need or their concern. So you want to focus on the fair, mutually agreeable outcome where both people can get some of their needs met. Examine your values. How do you want to be treated in a relationship? How do you want to treat others? What do you want to achieve? Not only regarding the conflict, but in this relationship. So knowing your values, this falls outside the scope of this workshop, but this is really important when you go into any negotiation, because if you don't know what your values are, then how do you know what would you be willing to compromise? You have to know that going in order to retain self-respect. If you're unclear about that, then the other person is probably going to be unclear about them too. And you may say something that you regret, or you make a concession that you later come to regret. And the final component here is neutral voice. Keep anger and contempt out of your voice. It's easy to pick up on that when somebody has contempt. Even if they're trying to stifle it. Um, so that's really all I have. You know, negotiating, a whole presentation could be made on that. And so it's important to keep in mind if you really do want to negotiate that and there's no solution in sight, it's okay to compromise. And so there are ways to compromise. You can take turns, you can do both, you can do a trial period, you can do tit for tat. There's another solution called I'll cut the pie, but you get to choose the first piece. You get part of what I want, part of what you want, or you can split the difference. My way when I'm doing it, your way when you're doing it. These can be particularly useful with roommates that are, say, not holding their end of the bargain. Maybe less so with parents or where there's a power differential. But, just this is just a very, very simple boilerplate for negotiating. Because a lot of it has to just do with where you're coming from and being aware of your intentions when you're negotiating and knowing what you're willing to compromise and what you're not willing to compromise. All right. Hope this is helpful.